Okay, so I typically start these with quotes from other people that are relevant to your work, because I generally find that it's like sort of fun to like weave together streams of thought of people who are thinking about similar things and connect it to what you're talking about generally, because the point of this show is connecting things to other things.
Okay.
And so I actually have two for you, and they're both pretty short. The first one is, it feels like we don't know how to belong to each other, to something big and collective and decolonizing, which is a quote from We Will Not Cancel Us by Adrienne Ray Brown. And then I don't know if you know Charles Eisenstein and his work at all.
I don't think so.
But he has this book, I think it was actually his first book, which is called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And in part of it, he says, when both sides of a controversy revel in the defeat and humiliation of the other side, in fact, they are on the same side, the side of war, which I thought was really interesting, because in a recent conversation, even my last episode that I released was on microbes plus spirituality. And the person I was interviewing was talking about how much or how often we become that which we resist. Like basically we're just sort of like reenacting the same sorts of things that we're actually trying to resist. Mm-hmm. So, and often I like to start just after a quote by asking folks like what tensions and contradictions it feels like you're presently holding right now.
Wow, what a great question. I guess, I don't know, I'm sure probably a large reason why you probably wanted to talk to me is because I feel like that's probably what I do in all areas of my thinking and my life, is that I'm constantly holding tensions together. And personally, I don't find that hard. And so it is kind of more confusing to me, I guess, to think about it being hard. But I think it's like I've gone on a long journey to get here. And I think there were other times in my life where it was hard, but now it just seems very obvious to me. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is all of the stuff that I write about cancel culture, because my commitment, my very strong commitment to like survivors, my writing has always, been trauma centered, right? Like I'm a survivor and my writing has always been about trauma and about survivors. So it was surprising to a lot of people when I became this like outspoken voice against cancel culture, because for many people, they're like, well, cancel culture is like a tool that we use to like support survivors, basically. Whereas for me, I actually don't see it that way. And I actually see cancel culture as like a reproduction of like abuse and like a normalization of abuse in our communities. And it isn't, sorry, there's a dog barking.
It's okay.
I live in a house with like a couple dogs. So, but yeah, for me, that isn't complicated. Like I can easily hold those two things. And there's like more than two things there. Like there's like, there's people who are making accusations, some of whom are survivors, some of whom are making false accusations, which is like a thing that you're not allowed to talk about.
Sure.
And then there's like people who are accused, some of whom haven't done the thing that they were accused of, and some of whom have. And then for me, I'm like, everybody in this situation deserves compassion and, human dignity. And we need to be able to like work with people to sort things out. And I also think that one of the fears that people have about me starting to point out that a lot of the things that go on with cancel culture are actually abusive behaviors. The reason that they're so worried about that is because in the worldview that we've created, people who have behaved abusively deserve to be dehumanized and deserve to be stripped of their community and everything dear to them. So if I start saying, well, actually what you're doing is abusive behavior, that's terrifying in that worldview, right?
Right.
But in my worldview, I'm not dehumanizing them. I'm not saying you did this thing and now therefore I have the right to like dominate you and humiliate you and take away things from you. Like instead, I'm actually saying like the issue I have is with this behavior, not with your humanity, which is a complicated position for a lot of people apparently, but due to my life experiences, it is not a complicated position.
Yeah. So so many things. I mean,
Yeah, I just dove in there with a
no, I mean, that's exactly perfect. I mean, of course, like that's exactly what you do in the world. And I mean, so interesting, because I actually thought maybe at one point you were going to sort of talk about too about the way that like maybe when you started speaking out about cancel culture, that like everyone around you was like, oh no, I can't be associated with Clementine
but
because
yeah, that definitely
like it's
happened.
just, it's so terrifying. Like people are just so terrified when like you are a symbol of like the things that people aren't allowed to say, and then all of a sudden it's like, you know, like I read something actually on your Instagram this morning, I was scrolling through it, that was talking about how it's like people are so fearful to be like associated with you, or like anyone really who speaks out about these sorts of things. And I was like, I mean, I'm about to have a podcast episode with her. Should I have some sort of like, you know, but I was like, it's such a stupid, I remember, so when I was thinking about the concept of this show, I mean, originally, I've said this multiple times in other recordings, but like my whole life, I've just been a person who likes combining seemingly disparate things together and finding like what sorts of insights we find at the intersection of those things. And so it really started, like the show started as more like an artistic thing that just allowed me to do these things that I love to do, which is combining these really cool things together. You know, like I found all this beauty in like combining art and science. And I also similarly was like, I'm so confused why people who are in science can't seem to understand that what they're doing is art, and people in art can't seem to understand why science is so important. And it was like such a class division between two apparently different groups of people. And you know, I had come from you know, like I'm queer. I came out when I was 27. And, you know, I think in between 27 and probably like 37, I was involved in a bunch of like social justice and organizing community and all those things. And I just saw the way that we were like fracturing. It was like only one person had one friend, because you couldn't hold any tensions with anybody else in any way. So like not even like egregious trauma that was enacted on each other. Like there was no real harm that was happening. It was like people just had different class, you know, politics, or different class backgrounds, or different, you know, views on race or whatever. But like, you couldn't say any of those things. And when you did anything that seemed to offend someone who had a different position within those identities, it was like, well, we can't be friends anymore. And it was like, often it was like, no one would even talk to you about it. It was like, I was just friends with people for like 3 years who then just like fucking disappeared. And I was like, I just don't understand, number one, what I did. Like, and number two, what would like lead someone who's been invested in a relationship for that long to just like cut people out of their lives. So it wasn't like I haven't necessarily gone through like any sort of like formal cancellation. I've just seen the way that like we genuinely cannot hold contradiction, it seems like. And I similarly have just never been a person who quite understood that, and understood like why someone all of a sudden was so demonized just because, you know, they believed something differently.
Totally.
And so, yeah, I think the podcast really, it feels a little like a different kind of way of talking about fucking canceled. You know, it's like, this is my way of going like, how can we practice holding contradiction?
Totally.
And
yeah, and diversity of thought, and like, having things together in the same place. Yeah.
So, can you though, for anyone who might not follow along with a ton of your stuff, explain what the nexus is?
Sure. So my partner Jay and I have a podcast called Fucking Canceled. And basically we just came up with, basically the nexus is like a placeholder that we use because there isn't actually a word for this phenomenon that we're talking about on the podcast. So when we talk about cancel culture, you know, cancel culture obviously means like campaigns of harassment, shaming, and social exile usually. But there's different kinds of cancel culture, and there actually is like there's a book that's called So You've Been Publicly Shamed, by John Ronson, and basically like he gives examples of cancel culture, and like some of those examples are like actually coming from more of the right and from like from a conservative place, right? Like there's like a girl who like makes she takes like photographs in like a veteran cemetery, like joking photographs, and she got like a huge campaign against her, but it was coming from like conservatives, you know. But for those of us who are on the left and who are in like social justice scenes, we have cancel culture, and it is a specific kind of cancel culture. And basically the nexus is the word that we use to describe this phenomenon that is a connection between cancel culture, so this like shaming, harassment, exile stuff, combined with identitarianism, which is basically a word that describes a type of politics that boils everything down to identity and identity alone, and also sees identity in a very homogenizing and essentialist way. So when you hear people saying things like the insert identity here perspective or the insert identity here community, and then making generalizing statements like that, that this group of people in this identity believe this, that is an example of identitarianism, and it's essentialist because it completely erases the diversity of thought that actually exists within any identity group. And it also uses, identitarianism also uses identity to like shut down conversation. So people will say like that you're not allowed to like talk about certain things or have opinions on certain things if you are in this identity. Like it's not your place. The whole like stay in your lane thing, which I have problems with for lots of reasons that I can get into, but that's a brief definition of identitarianism. And then the other component is social media. So we have identitarianism plus cancel culture playing out in this like hyper alienated online space of social media. And so that's what we use the nexus as a shorthand to describe. And there's like very specific kind of phenomena that play out in these scenes. And, you know, you could see these scenes as like sort of developing, you know, over the course of many years, and like, you know, kind of having like a heyday on Tumblr there for a while. But for a long time, it was sort of like a minority perspective. Like it was like there was people who were like, you know, like the right would call them like social justice warriors, you know. But then like it's becoming more and more and more mainstream, and now you have like big brands like Amazon and stuff like that, and also like, you know, politicians and stuff sort of signaling their awareness of the rules of the nexus. And one of the key issues that like Jay and I talk about on the podcast, about one of the problems about what goes on with the nexus, is that unfortunately, even though this type of politics, if you can call it that, claims to be about justice, it's actually very, very surface. And a lot of the concerns that people have within the nexus are actually about things like using the correct language, like deferring to the people that you're told to defer to, basically like memorizing a set of rules, which are also kind of contradictory and always changing, and then performing them correctly and making sure that you're posting about the right things, the right amount, and not posting about other things that you're not supposed to post about, and sort of flagging and signaling your awareness of the rules. And it's all very like surface and symbolic. And as a leftist, as a socialist, I am interested in the redistribution of power, and actually people's like material conditions, you know, which it's pretty crazy when you have, you know, like American politicians and stuff sort of nodding towards like identitarianism. Meanwhile, Americans don't have healthcare. You know what I mean? Like, so that's like a brief description. And obviously, like, we can talk about it more if you want, and we go into it in a lot more detail on the fucking canceled podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot, I mean, there's a lot in there that I want to sort of pull out. And I think one is like, yeah, that experience for me of being in, let's say, like queer and social justice and organizing communities, where like at some point I started to be like, why does this feel like the religion that I left when I was a kid?
Yes.
And also like, why do I feel like there's only one right way to be queer? Like apparently we're all supposed to look the same, and it's supposed to be like a completely homogenous middle. Like we're all androgynous, and also like we're only supposed to like believe certain things and say certain things and behave a certain way, and we dress a certain way. And like we all get grad school degrees and we all like, and it was just so essentialist that at some point I was like, this, what if I have a question?
Yeah.
Like I just really question some of this and I don't understand. And it really was, it was like impossible to actually voice honest questions.
Yeah.
To be like, why is this happening? Or why do we look this certain way? And it was like, well, that's misogynist, or that's classist, or that's whatever. And I'm like, whoa, why is it those things to even ask a question? Like,
Yeah, totally. And like, so yeah, what you're saying is really important. And like, basically, somebody shared this book with me that is called Terror, Love, and Brainwashing. And it's about cults and also fundamentalist religions. And basically, this person shared it with me because they were like, what you talk about the nexus, like when I was reading this book, it reminds me of this. So you should check it out. And I read it and I was like, wow, like this framework of understanding fundamentalism I actually think is like really key to understanding what is going on in the nexus, or if you want to call it like social justice culture or whatever you want to call it, because it actually doesn't function like a politics. It functions like a religion. And if you look like on the left more broadly and more historically, like leftists, people who generally agree on the basic premise that people should be given the things that they need to survive, and also that people should be free to be who they are. Like if we just agree that those are sort of the basics, this simplified way of saying what leftists generally believe. If you listen to leftists over the course of history and also even today, they strongly disagree with each other about how we should achieve those goals. Like there's always been a huge amount of disagreement about specifically how we would get there and what those goals even really mean in practice and so on, right?
yeah.
And it was always you know, even when you're outside of the nexus in other leftist spaces, like if you're around like sort of like the Marxist types, like they are always debating each other and having like big debates about how they think this is right and this is wrong. But like they're allowed to talk about that with each other, even if they're very much like you're wrong, they're still like allowed to have the conversation. Totally. Whereas within the nexus, you're not allowed to have the conversation. And if you disagree, it's like, or even ask a question, like you said, it's like in the same way with like fundamentalist religion, it's like you're showing a lack of faith, you're showing a lack of adherence to the orthodoxy. Right. And so like that is a punishable offense in and of itself, you know? And so you actually have people like repeating these things that they've heard online usually, or in their friend groups, that they know are supposed to be correct, that they're supposed to say them and say them with like a great deal of like authority, but like they actually haven't really thought about these things deeply. Right. Or considered or unpacked like what they're even saying. Right. Which is part of the reason why I'm like, you know, not only is this like really scary and cult-like, but it's also it actually makes us very ineffective political actors, because it's like if all we're doing is like memorizing a set of rules and just sort of following along, and none of us are like taking our political commitments truly seriously in the sense that we're like thinking deeply about them and trying to see if they make sense to us and if we're acting in a way that actually we think is effective and makes sense, then obviously, you know, we're not very effective political actors. And I mean, the fact that we're constantly canceling each other and like that every sort of organizing project or like political attempt at anything is like blown up from the inside through these like cancel campaigns is like obviously really bad for the left. So
yeah, in general, I think it's bad for everybody. I mean, it's really not serving anything. And yeah, I mean, it's like the speed with which social media also as part of that nexus, like plays a role.
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
At some point I was like, I mean, especially last year, like in the middle of like George Floyd riots and everything, I was like, I just like don't even have time to like sit and integrate any of what's happening. Like people are just like pumping shit out constantly. And it's but yeah, like what you've just described is a religion. Like I don't, you know, at least a harmful version of a religion. And you know, in your opening episode with Jay, you talk about like the sort of guiding principles of what you guys are operating around in the podcast, and I'm sure even well beyond the podcast in your lives. And one of those things is talking about yeah, like knowing, like being in your own integrity. So like knowing what your own principles are also, and being able to like make your decisions around that. And like, I've had this quote on my wall in my bedroom written by someone. I think it's from a documentary that he was in, or a documentary that was about him. And it's talking about religion and like Judaism, I think specifically, but it's like questions and doubt like aren't leaving the faith. They are actually part and parcel of the faith. Like in Judaism, as far as I understand, and that's not my religion. I grew up in like the South and sort of Christian culture, but like still sort of a, God facing religion that like, or monotheistic, I guess, was like, I just like, it became so important to me to believe that, so in Jewish culture, I guess, like that there was this, like there's a culture around ancient traditions of like debate, like you're talking about like public forum and the left missing a public forum and that sort of thing, where like we're actually allowed to have those conversations. And I was like, if integrity for me is really valuing questions and doubt and like critical dialogue as part of this process for me, but I'm engaging in these cultures that like will not allow that, like just will not allow questions to be asked at any point. Like it's literally the religion I left when I was, in my early 20s. And it's like, okay, well, that for me is just like a no-go. But yeah, it was like, I think too, what you're describing, and you and Jay also sort of talk about this, but like it's a kind of hyper-vigilance to me. Like the sort of extra connection I make is like the way that all of our health is degrading.
Yes.
At least in the US, if not the entire, and also Canada, I'm sure, but like the Western world, like we are so constantly hyper-vigilant of the way that we're supposed to like behave, or the right words we're supposed to say, or like who we should and should not be around in order to be like safe. Like I was saying even earlier, like there's a type of hyper-vigilance about being like, can I even be associated with, like in conversation with someone like Clementine, or like, will I be outed? Like, it's just such a constant, like having to check whether or not someone is okay to be like associated with. And I actually genuinely think it's destroying our health. Like not literally like just as a society, but like actually our physical health, because the way that we're having to be constantly aware of everything around us is not only a constant reenactment of trauma, like that when you're a child and you're in a traumatic situation, that you're constantly having to be like cognizant of all the possible threats around you. Like we're just continuing that and never actually like internally examining what's happening there. And I mean, at some point, like I see so often how so many people are like, oh, hello, today on Instagram, here's the new word that white queers can't use anymore. And, it's like, oh, okay, cool. Now I know that there are 2 more words I can't use, but like, do I have to be constantly on social media to understand like what words I can and can't use? And also like, I just got really disturbed because at some point I was like, how is this not like building borders? Like, if the right is over here, like arguing that we should be building borders to keep certain people in and out, and the left is like, that's stupid. Why would you ever do that? Accept immigrants. They're great. Like they're part of this country. They're all those things. And meanwhile, we're like building language borders around each other, like that continually wall off more and more and more of what we can't do. I was like, this just doesn't feel like it's actually politically aligned and ethically aligned with what I believe. So, and also to your point, I think I was like, what does me not saying the word boy, like BOI,
right?
Like, what does me not saying that in my house every day, like going to actually materially change the lives of people who are people of color who don't have access to certain like material wealth or opportunities that I do? Like, I just genuinely don't know that that's actually making the difference that I want it to make.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also like, there's an interesting way in which these rules, they actually function. They definitely function as like the inside outside, like who knows the rules and who doesn't know the rules.
Right.
And there is a way in which it's tied up with class, because as you said, like a lot of these people who are inside the nexus are like grad student types. Like a lot of these ideas and these rules are coming out of universities. Not everybody in the nexus is university educated, but because we disseminate these rules online, there is like an element in which it is like a class signifier to know what you are and are not allowed to say, right? And it does take a lot of work, because you basically have to study all the time because the rules change all the time. So it's like, and I've been basically in this culture for like I took a break because I'm an alcoholic and I was drunk for several years there.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I've been in this culture since I was a teenager. And then like adjacent to it and then back in it again. And like the rules have changed and sometimes have like there's been like huge arguments about like what is the correct way to say something. And then people like kind of forgot that we already had that discussion. And then like the argument happens again like 5 years later. And so you have to constantly be studying it. You have to constantly be on guard. And there's just lots of people who literally don't know about these rules and are just living their normal lives. And they can get into like a huge amount of trouble if they just live their normal life in front of like somebody who does know the rules and tells them, actually, you know, you're not allowed to do this.
Right. And it's like I have
Yeah.
to constantly be on social media and in those conversations in order to constantly understand what I am and am not supposed to do, which means that like I'm not actually very present in my daily life. Like,
Yeah. I remember like, and this is just an example, like an anecdote of this, but it's like this combined, like all of these rules combined with like the hypervigilance, right? Like the fear that like fucking up in some way is going to have very serious consequences, which it's not a fear for no reason because we've seen that happen to other people, right? So it's like, you know, if I make this mistake, if I don't remember the rule or I do something incorrect, I'm going to get into so much trouble. And when I was very deep inside the nexus, I knew all the rules inside and out because I already have PTSD. So like my compulsion with like keeping track of what is going to keep me safe was like really, really intense for me. So I always knew, like, I was always like ahead of the curve, like what is like problematic now, you know? And but like of course I'm still a human in the world and like there's just like normal ways that people talk that I had been, you know, talking like that my whole life, that suddenly it was like I wasn't really supposed to talk like that anymore. And so I had to like constantly monitor myself to make sure I wasn't. And like I remember, and this is just so like not helpful for anyone, but basically I would not let myself say hey guys because of the idea that like guys
like
is like gendered
misogynistic or something.
language,
Yeah.
is gender language and you should say it, right? So I was like, but saying hey guys is like just like a very normal part of the way that I speak and literally have always spoken my whole life. So like trying to like weed that out of my language was like really hard and I tried. And once I had recently moved in with someone who was like trans feminine, like gender non-conforming person. And I walked into the room and I said, hey guys. And then I got so anxious, especially because this person was like trans. And I was worried somehow that this was like especially offensive to them. And I was like, you know, I basically had like a panic attack and I couldn't stop compulsively thinking about it. And then I made this like very awkward apology to the person where I was like, I'm so sorry that I said this to you. And I'm just like, this is so weird. And it's making me act weird around a trans person for no reason. Like this person was like, why? It's like, you know, I was like hyper focusing on their gender because I was like, oh, this is especially offensive because I did this to a trans feminine person. When in fact, like now I understand that what was offensive was the fact that I was hyper fixated on this person being trans feminine and not able to just act like a normal person around them and just be normal because they're just another person and there was really no need for me to make a big deal out of it, you know? And so now in my life today, now that I'm like, you know, outside of the nexus or like I don't follow the rules anymore, I just say hey guys all the time because it's very freeing for me to say it because I'm just like, I know there's people who are going to tell me I'm not allowed to say hey guys, but I personally think that it's fine for me to say that.
Right. Like there's a way in which having to make sure you are or aren't saying the right thing or doing the right thing means that you're hyper fixated on the thing, which is like, hold on a second, isn't the whole point that we're not like hyper focused on someone's race or class or gender or whatever, you know? It's like,
yeah, we should be able to talk to people. Like obviously people's like specific experiences matter and also people in identity groups don't all have the same experiences as each other because of their lives are complex. But like it is very like weird and not a good thing to basically be like hyper vigilant and dishonest and act weird around people based on their identities. And I actually think that this is something that is increasing because of the nexus. It makes people act really weird and just not be able to have like normal, genuine intimacy with people of different identities in their life.
Yeah. Okay. So being someone who has experienced trauma and also talking about cancel culture, I feel like my constant tension is just like trying to figure out, I don't know. I have this like ongoing internal, you know, dialogue that's like, I don't know. I think a couple weeks ago, I was on Instagram, which apparently is where all this happens for me. Mostly, I think that's because we're just so isolated right now because of sickness. But anyway, someone basically does a lot of content that's almost entirely focused on pointing out people who have done things wrong. And I was so infuriated by it because I'm just like, I'm both infuriated, but also like the internal dialogue for me is like, okay, Brainy, but like where and how do we actually like address harm? I'm guessing that like people ask you that all the time because you're like, you know, anti-cancel culture, and they're like, yeah, but what happens when people do bad things? You know, because I get what this person is doing in the world and going like, it's important that we don't just let the voices of trauma survivors, especially in sexual assault survivors and like everyone who falls under a trauma umbrella, which is almost everybody, that like their voices don't continue to get erased or they're not believed and all those things, right? And that hopefully this person, whoever enacted the harm, doesn't keep doing that thing. But like basically what we've done is creating a culture in which there are enemies and there are the good people. And yeah, like you've been saying, like our whole lives sort of become about making sure that we're the good people and we're hyper vigilant about not getting kicked out of that group. But I just truly don't see the benefit of making sure that everyone knows who the bad people are. And yeah, so I guess I was, you know, seeing all of that content and then going like, I know I'm talking to Clementine soon. So like, what would I ask Clementine? Which is basically like, but how? You know, like how do we, I mean, I think in part in listening to you and Jay, just I think using AA stuff is so useful in the way that you guys like, I think especially because AA is like so successful in bringing together groups of people who were like incredibly different and building community. But generally like, yeah, how harm gets addressed in those ways. And I guess this is sort of all over the place, but like the differences, I guess, between like allyship and being a comrade and solidarity and like all of those things, like how do we actually make sure that harm doesn't continue and we actually start shifting material wealth?
So, I mean, it's a big question. There's a lot there, but I guess there's a few things, right? The first thing that I'll start with is that one of the things that has happened inside the Nexus is a complete collapse of the meanings of words and a complete lack of specificity. The word harm at this point, I'm just like, I have no fucking idea what somebody means when they say that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it means that they, you know, didn't post about a political issue that they were supposed to post about, or whether they are being accused of rape, you know, like it is so vague, you know, and unfortunately, a similar thing is happening to the word abuse, where people are being called abusers for things that actually are not abusive behaviors. And it's upsetting and frustrating. And I've written about this, but basically, like, we need to have a clear definition of what words mean if we're going to have appropriate responses to anything, you know, because there is a difference between somebody having, you know, a leftist political opinion that is somewhat different than yours and somebody who is, you know, repeatedly assaulting people in their life, you know. These have different, we need to have different responses to those things. So that's the first piece. Is that we really need to get clear about what we specifically are talking about. And part of the problem with the narrative of simply believe survivors is that it literally just means believe accusations. And it creates a situation where people can actually use accusations to be abusive. And we actually have arrived there now. Like, this is something that is happening and happens actually a lot. And because of the person that I am, and because I have because people trust me with their stories. I hear so many stories about this where basically, you know, people are in like a dysfunctional relationship that isn't happy, you know, neither of them are necessarily acting like their best selves, but it is like a mutually unhappy relationship. And one of them is like, okay, I'm getting out. And then the other one slams them with accusations of like vaguely defined abuse, and then now has the right to basically permanently destroy this person's life and to like prevent them from having new relationships, prevent them sometimes from having employment, like really severe material and personal and social consequences, right? That has no end in sight either. It can go on for years and years. And there's no way for the person to defend themselves. If the person tries to defend themselves and say, actually, this is my perspective on the relationship, people will just say like, that's like gaslighting and it's abuse, you know? So that's like it's pretty fucked up. And like, as a survivor of domestic violence, because I am a survivor of domestic violence, like I was physically abused by my ex-partner when I was in my early 20s. Like, I know that it is a common like abusive logic to be like, if I can't have you, nobody can, you know? And the fixation on your ex and being like, like the idea of my ex being with someone else or being happy without me drives me insane. Like, people who have trauma, people who have disorganized attachment, people who have anxious preoccupied attachment can have very severe, intense reactions to that. And unfortunately, if that reaction is not held in an appropriate container, if they aren't given the support that they need to move through that reaction in a healthy way, that can lead to abusive behavior. And we see this in domestic violence already, where the abusive person, often but not always a dude, is literally losing it because they can't let it go, that like they are no longer in the relationship and they no longer have that connection and also that control. And so they're like, I'm now going to stalk you, you know? The parallels between that and a lot of these cancellation campaigns that I see is like incredibly striking to me, where this person is like, well, I'm calling you an abuser now. And so from now on, I actually get to harass you and to come into your life, even if the other person is like, I don't want to have any contact with you. It's like the accusing person now has the right to disrupt everything that person tries to do in their future. Like, it's pretty disturbing. And we have no checks or balances. We have no way to like check to see if these accusations are founded in any way. And often the accusations themselves are like incredibly vague. It's like there's no actual content saying like what this person did. It's just like this person was abusive. And just calling someone abusive, you know, what do we mean, right? And I have had experience with this. So I wrote an article about it. It's called, I called my ex abusive when they weren't. And basically, like, I have complex PTSD. I was abused in my childhood. Had domestic violence in my early 20s. I have very severe trauma. And when I was in my mid 20s, I had a partnership that was, you know, quite unhappy, in which my needs weren't met. We were monogamous, but like my partner was very obviously interested in other people and like wasn't giving me a lot of attention. And I was like very unhappy, and my attempts at like communicating in that relationship didn't really work. And I stayed in that relationship for years, even though I was really unhappy in it. And I was like crying all the time, and I was like really depressed. And finally I got to a point where I was like, this relationship isn't meeting my needs. Like, I have to get out of this. And I did. And then as soon as I got out, you know, I was like fucking devastated. And the thought of my ex being with other people and just moving on, which they like immediately did, just, it made me have a mental breakdown, you know? And I was like sobbing and crying. And my ex was like immediately on dating apps and just like having a great time. If you couldn't guess, my ex was avoidant and I was anxious preoccupied. But whatever.
I didn't never experience that. It's never.
And I had no language for understanding what was happening, you know? And so when I left that relationship and I started talking with a friend about it, the friend was like, that sounds like emotional abuse. And so for me, when I took that on and I was like, that sounds like emotional abuse, I was suddenly, instead of just being devastated, I was angry. And I felt regulated by that. And it felt good to think about it that way, because then I could feel angry at my ex, you know? And so I started to say that to people. I started to tell people, and I didn't feel like I was lying, you know? I really didn't think I was lying. I started to tell people that my ex had been abusive. And now when I look back at that, I'm like, this is very unclear. because it's like my one ex from when I was in my early 20s put me through a wall, you know? This other ex would like go on their phone when we were at dinner together and kind of ignore me and scroll. They're not the same. That's not the same thing. And like definitely my one ex was like not a great partner. You know, they were like an avoidant person who didn't know how to deal with their own avoidant stuff and was like not showing up in a very good way in the relationship. Also, neither was I, if I'm honest. You know, I was not, I didn't know how to deal with my anxious stuff. But anyway, so I did. Fortunately, I did not create a giant cancel campaign, but I like let some rumors get out there. And then a couple years later, working with a trusted therapist, you know, who knew about this relationship, but didn't know that I defined it as abuse. Well, I just said that one day. I was like, well, because my ex was emotionally abusive. And my therapist was like, that was an unhappy relationship. That was not an abusive one. And as a person with complex trauma, it's very important that you understand the difference. And so, yes, I see a lot of that going on. And I feel like it's a really big problem, because the idea that, because a lot of people have childhood trauma. And part of what childhood trauma does is it makes our nervous systems react in ways that are completely disproportionate to what is going on in the present moment. That's literally what trauma is. And so if you just tell people with complex trauma that whatever they're perceiving emotionally is just reflective of reality and true, that's not helpful for anyone. And it's not helpful for a person with complex trauma who actually needs community members and friends and a therapist to like talk to them about the specific content of what happened, as well as the emotional response, and then to discern, is the emotional response actually appropriate to the content of what happened? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. So that's one piece, because with a lot of this stuff, I'm like, you know, the accusations and stuff are not even, they're very unclear, and the response that is happening is very extreme. And we don't even know if this person has actually done what they're being accused of. And so that is very disturbing to me. But then there are situations where somebody has done something that is abusive. Obviously, like abusive things happen all the time. So there are situations where people have been abusive. And there are situations where people have a pattern of being abusive and they are continuing to be abusive. So like basically for me, the main tools that I think are like useful here, instead of cancel culture, are what I call intervention and what I call responsibility, and also boundaries. And so basically, like there's a episode of Fucking Canceled where we like unpack all of this stuff in great detail, but just like in a quick synopsis. Intervention is when you intervene on violence that is happening, right? So it's like if you see someone assaulting someone else or attempting to assault someone else, or you see someone behaving in a way that is dehumanizing or abusive, you should intervene. And we should actually be building communities with like a robust skill set for how to actually de-escalate and intervene on violent and abusive situations, which is something that I know a lot about and I have a lot of experience doing. And I wish we would talk about that more, because it would actually be a helpful skill to have, you know? So yes, we should be intervening. Sometimes, you know, intervention can mean things like putting a limit on where someone is welcome or what they're able to do. So for example, if a person, you know, I'm trying to think of like a specific example of this, but it's like if a person like, you know, specifically used a position of power in a specific job to gain access to someone and sexually assault them, then perhaps, you know, we would look at that and be like, okay, like actually you're abusing your power in this position. So this position is something that you can't do until you have changed your behavior. So sometimes intervention can look like that. But very often we're like, somebody did something abusive, it means they can't have anything in their life at all, which isn't actually helpful, because people need to have lives, even people who have been abusive, and just like taking everything away from someone is not actually an effective way to get them to change.
Right. It's
like,
it's a type of prison culture.
Yeah, like, it is. And it's like, we're punishing you so that now, you know, you won't want to do the bad thing because look at the consequences. But it doesn't actually make sense, because you see in cancel culture, the consequences, they never stop and they never go away, even if the person does do the work of changing. So like, what is the motivation or the incentive for the person to do that work if they know that they are permanently defined by the things that they did? And so this brings me to like responsibility, which is something that I have learned through my experience with 12 steps, which is basically that, yes, it is possible to take responsibility if you have behaved in an abusive way, or if you have behaved in a way that is outside of your integrity, or in a way that was like hurtful to other people. And to do that is a whole process that requires community support. You can't do it alone. You actually need community to do it. And you need to figure out like why you did that and like what is going on for you, and like you will need support, and you will need to be able to make changes in your life to like actually transform that behavior in a consistent and realistic and ongoing way. So usually that will involve therapy. For some people, it involve like substance use issues. It might involve like understanding your attachment stuff, whatever. Like there's like lots of contributing factors. That process needs to happen. The person needs to be supported through that process. And then basically, eventually, they should make amends if that amends is welcomed, and if they are able to do it in a genuine way, having changed their behavior. And it's great when that happens, and it is something that can happen and does happen. But the problem is, and the thing that people can't wrap their minds around, that I get really upset about, is that people can only take responsibility if they are willing to take responsibility. You actually can't force someone to take responsibility, because then it won't be genuine. They won't actually be taking responsibility. They will just be doing what they think that you want them to do so that you stop harassing them, you know? And so I think what it comes down to is that people are just like, it's not fair. This person did this thing and it's fucked up and they haven't taken responsibility. So that's wrong. And so we need to do something about it. We need to force them to take responsibility or take away everything from them until they do. And I think like on some level, this is just like, it's like a fundamental unwillingness to just be with reality and to accept that actually fucked up things do happen. And it really, really is not fair. It's wrong. It's upsetting. We should definitely intervene if we have the capacity to prevent that from happening. But if it has already happened, there is nothing that any of us can do to make it not have happened. And also, we actually we do not have the power to force someone to genuinely take responsibility. So, you know, that's just true. And it sucks. And there's like grief that comes with that I think that people are unwilling to do, you know? And when people are just like, well, what are you supposed to do? Like, I'm just like, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that survivors cannot move on with their life if they have not received responsibility from the person who abused them? Because to me, that's a very disempowering narrative for survivors. I think it's very unlikely that I will receive genuine amends and repair from my family of origin, or from my like really abusive partner, or from like many of the people who have done really fucked up things to me. I think I will probably never get that in my life. And I wish I would. It would be much better and more fair if I did get that. I deserve that, but I probably won't ever get it. And that's just true. And I still have the capacity to like heal, to grow, to have my boundaries, to move on with my life. And that is a much more empowering narrative for survivors than linking our capacity to heal to whether or not the person who abused us is ever going to take responsibility. So I just had 10 million things, but you asked me a very big question. So
no, that's good. That's a fittingly large answer. Yeah, I mean, that it's disempowering in part, like you said, just because it's like the rarity with which that happens is so, it's so small. Like to tell that to everybody, like you have to be able to get apologies or remorse or any sort of action from the people who have abused you or caused harm is, it doesn't feel very helpful to me. But yeah, it's just so hard for me. Like, it's like, how do we believe in abolition and also think that like this sort of culture actually works? It's so confusing I'm like, this is exactly the same thing. Like we're just removing people from community.
It's very contradictory.
Yeah, getting people out of our line of sight. So like someone else has to take care of it. And whether or not that ever actually gets healed is like a totally different story. And in large part probably doesn't get healed because we know that recidivism from people who have gone through prison or jail is like pretty high. Like it's just, it doesn't work in general. But I guess like one of the things that I've really questioned too is like whether or not we have to be in actual like close community or in direct relationship with people in order for critique to be worthwhile. You know what I mean? Because you were saying like, I mean, part of that like example about being like your ex, for instance, like if you're making accusations about an ex, oftentimes everyone else doesn't actually know if it's true.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
literally no way for us to know if it's true.
Yeah.
And I've had friends, and I've been a person too, who like went through relationships and on the other side of it was devastated and was like, oh yeah, that person was emotionally abusive. Like that makes so
Yeah.
much sense. And it's very internally comforting to me. And then, yeah, that sort of narrative gets spread amongst community. But like, I just don't know personally if it's worthwhile for me to engage. I'm not saying it's not worthwhile, like to offer a critique of something. So like we don't have direct relationship with our government, you know, in a lot
Yeah.
of ways, unfortunately, at least at a federal level. So like critiquing political things at that sort of level feels worthwhile to have like debate about those things, but how they get lived out closer to home feels so much more useful to me. And also like, I don't know, I just don't know. I'm like, so if we are like activists or organizers or whatever, and we're just like critiquing a bunch of people online who we actually aren't even in direct relationship with, I just don't even know what it serves to like offer the critique. Like, is it to
Yeah.
warn other people? And again, is that like just spreading a narrative that's actually not useful? Like it doesn't actually cause any change. So like, is it really only useful to be because you have relationships of responsibility and solidarity with people you're close to. And so like, I don't know how we do it otherwise, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, sharing accusations online that you actually have no idea if they're true or not is not a critique. Because like critique is about, sharing your ideas and feedback about some information that you have, right? Like if you saw someone say and do something, you could critique what they said and did, because
Right.
you're engaging with what they said and did. But if you're just repeating something that you heard, it's not a critique because it's like you actually are just repeating, you're sharing information, but you don't know if the information that you're sharing is true. And like part of what, is I think really difficult for people to wrap their minds around is that we are actually responsible for the things that we say, and we are responsible for the impact that those things have on people's lives. And so to accuse someone, like people think that if they repeat an accusation that they aren't accusing them, they're just so they don't feel responsible. But in fact, you are accusing them when you say so and so is abusive, or so and so is an abuser, or whatever it is, so and so is a known harm causer. um, you actually are accusing them. And if you don't actually know if what you're accusing them of is true, or you don't have some kind of reason for like why you actually think that, right? Then it's very, very irresponsible because you are very likely like participating in something. I mean, you have no idea if you're participating in something ethical or not because you actually don't know the truth of what you're saying. And so when it comes to like the actual process of like discerning the content of an accusation, that can really only happen in close relationships, right? Like it has to be the people close to this person who are going to be like, you know, like if someone were to come to me and to be like, I was abused by my ex-partner, like I would, in a supportive way, want to talk to them about what happened in that relationship, And it's not to be like, oh, well, obviously you're lying, but it's to be like, okay, like, let's talk about what happened in that relationship. Like, I'm concerned about you. I'm concerned about, what you're saying. Like, that sounds really intense. And then if a person described to me then a situation that sounds like an unhappy relationship, but I don't hear anything about, you know, physical and sexual violence, humiliation, degradation, attempts at control, like, because yes, like abusive relationships don't have to be a physically abusive relationship. If your partner is like constantly like screaming at you and like insulting you, or trying to humiliate you, or trying to control everything that you do, like these can all be examples of abuse. But yeah, I would want more information about why they're saying that. And then that would like prompt me to respond in specific ways, none of which would be to post it on the internet, you know, even if it was an abusive situation. But like, yeah, I'm just like the complete handing over of responsibility to be like, I can just repeat things that I don't actually know the truth of and spread them to thousands of people online and know that this is going to have profound impacts on this person's life. Like, because we all know, like we act like we don't, like that all we're doing is just sharing something, but we all know what the consequences are going to be on that person's life. This person is going to be unable to date, like they're going to be unable to make new friends. It's going to be on Google. The chances of them being able to get a job, if you Google their name and it says this person is a abuser, is like, it's very, very serious consequences on this person's life. So it's like, you actually have to take that seriously and be like, wow, I'm taking part in something that is like really, really severe, which is why, like, you know, and as like abolitionists, as like many people, you know, inside the nexus now call themselves abolitionists, it's like due process, the idea of a trial, the idea that the accused had the right to defend themselves and to say their side of things was a good thing. It was always, we always thought that was a good thing. Mm-hmm. Now we've just gotten rid of that altogether. And it's just like, you know, guilty as soon as you're accused without any opportunity for the accused person to like defend themselves or say what they think about the situation.
Yeah. I guess there's part of me who just like wonders in general if there's like any real benefit to even sharing anything on the internet about it at all. You know, it's like, even if I know something to be true, like,
yeah, like what is the point? Like, what are you actually trying to do with that?
Yeah. Are you trying to outright like hurt someone's life in some way?
I mean, what they say is it's for safety because they're like, oh, we're warning people. But like, it's not very effective, even if that is the reason, because it's like, there's no way that we're going to be able to warn everybody
right
about every person who might be abusive. In fact, we need to be building like communities that actually know how to intervene on abuse. And we need to be teaching people who are vulnerable to being abused, which is often people with complex trauma or people who have substance use issues or people who have like a trauma history, like generally speaking, like the rates of people who are in domestic violence relationships who are also abused as children is like very, very high, you know? So we should be reaching out to people who are vulnerable and helping to build skills and to like helping to them to know like what red flags are and like having strong communities so that you can turn to someone before shit gets really bad. Like there's lots of things that we can do to like try to increase safety in our communities and address domestic violence and things like that. But it's like, yeah, I don't actually. And the other thing that I find absurd about it all is that because I was, you know, abused in a domestic violence situation, if I had posted on the internet about that, I would have been putting my life in danger.
Right.
It's actually like a very bad idea. Like if a person is like a very dangerous person who physically assaults people and is like, that type of person would be enraged by this and would very likely retaliate in a very bad way, you know? Mm-hmm. So I'm just like, it's just not a very effective strategy.
Yeah.
In and of itself.
I mean, it's like, to me, again, it's like nothing is, I don't know, everything is connected to everything else in the sense that like, I again sort of go back to health. So like when we think about like you talking about building skills and helping folks who are prone to trauma and generally anyone, I feel like anyone could stand to learn skills around noticing, you know, flags for when you might be vulnerable to trauma, or folks might be displaying behaviors that are should actually be sort of kept watch on. It's not the right word, but you know what I mean, I think. Like skill building as opposed to punishing people after the fact.
Yeah.
Is just like the same thing that we do in treating disease. You know, it's like we are more interested in taking a pill that will get rid of the problem than asking why the fuck we're sick in the first place and getting at some sort of root cause. Like,
exactly.
And so I think that culture is just pervasive everywhere, you know, like it would just behoove us and often probably cost less money for us to like actually build within our systems methods of learning these like skills that would help us be healthy, functional, happy humans And instead, what we feel like is better or easier to do is actually just punish people after the fact and then write it off as like, we can just forget about it.
Yeah.
I think my COVID is starting to catch up with me, so I'm
Oh
gonna wrap up shortly. But earlier I was like, when we started, you were talking about like when you first got into this and decided to start doing it, and I meant to sort of tell a story about like sort of close the loop on that. Like for me, when I was starting to think about doing the podcast, I was like, do I really fucking want to do this? Because it's like at its core, it turned out to be about helping us hopefully learn to hold more complexity and nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, when you do that, you sort of sign up to be someone who's like, hold on a second. If you're on this side, I'm going to tell you that like, I'm not totally sure I believe you, or like everything that you believe.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're on this side, I also feel the same way. Like I'm not really in either camp. And so there's like this constant, it's like opting into a life where you have to sort of constantly explain yourself to people who like think that because you don't fit exactly in their bucket that like you belong in the other group. And you're like, yeah, but I don't totally believe the other group either. And so am I just like signing up for a lifetime of having to defend myself, which just feels tiring. Feels really tiring. So I think from one person who's doing somewhat similar work in the world to you, I think I was just going to be like, why do you keep doing it? Like, why does it matter to you? And like, what drives that work for you to not just that you started it, but that you every day wake up and continue to choose doing it? And also what brings you joy?
Right. Great questions. Honestly, it's crazy. Like the path I've chosen is extremely hard, and I experienced so much harassment and so much crazy shit because of the path that I've chosen. But the reason that I do what I do is literally the same reason that I've always done what I've done. And it's literally because my fundamental core values are that I oppose abuse, I oppose dehumanization, and I believe in compassion. And I believe that every single person deserves compassion and to have their boundaries respected. And like, as a survivor of child abuse, like these are just my fundamental core, most important beliefs, that violating people's like their personal integrity and autonomy and abusing them is wrong. And so unfortunately, I see that cancel culture is doing that, even though they're pretending the opposite. And so even though it's very hard and scary to like stand up against that, and I receive so much backlash, it's to me the same theme of my entire life, right? It's like I have many times stood up against things and received backlash, but it's like, if this is my true integrity and like what I believe to be right, like of course I'm going to do it, and like I talk to people all the time who are like literally suicidal and are so like the things that I hear are so awful, of the things that people go through. And these people they didn't even do anything. Sometimes they did, and often they literally didn't even do anything. And I'm like, they are being so dehumanized and exiled, and no one fucking cares about them. No one thinks that they're worthy of compassion. No one thinks that they're worthy of even listening to. And so of course I'm going to align myself with the people who are being dehumanized and pushed out of our communities, and try to rehumanize them and offer them compassion and community and hope. So like that is why. And what brings me joy is my dog. Largely my dog, like I like to see her play, and she teaches me a lot about just like, the simple joys of life. And things can get really heavy, but it's nice to just like watch my dog play with a stick.
Yeah. I think in terms of your first answer about why you do this, I mean, I think I feel similarly. Like I've spent so much of my life thinking like, man, I really wish I could not, like I wish I couldn't, but like, it's just so core to who I am. I feel like it feels impossible. Like, I don't want to live in a world in which I'm not remaining true to my integrity, even if I don't know, sometimes it feels like you're the only one. And you're like, I don't know, I'd rather be the only one, I guess, at some point. But I feel like, to me, I'm like, we're dying. Like, I genuinely, like, we're dying, the planet is, the climate is tanking. We're less and less connected to each other. And I really do think that this is so effective of our like actual health. And like cancel culture is part of that, and the hyper-vigilance and trauma, and like the way that we treat each other, and the way that we see each other as disposable, and all those things. Like, I mean, even just like cheesily, I mean, Brene Brown even has done so much research about like how like it's as affecting of your health to be cut out of community as it is to smoke
100%.
all the time.
100%.
Like, so
we're social animals.
Yeah, we're completely social animals. And so I genuinely am just like, I don't feel like I can't not do this, because I'm watching people die. Like, I can't just like watch people die,
Yeah.
And me included. Like, I just don't think that we can have a healthy society. Like, I don't think I can individually get healthy if other people are sick. And I feel like other people are sick. And whether or not I have some sort of insight to that or not, like, if I think I do, it feels profoundly irresponsible for me not to share it.
Yep.
To be like, well, hold on a second, you guys, like, what about this? Like,
yeah.
And yeah, I think to your point about dehumanization, like, I think at its core for me, it's about being like, wait, like, I know that it would be so easy for me to call this person terrible or evil or bad or whatever, but like, it's such a slippery slope. I'm like, yeah, okay, well, if that's the sort of sieve that we put everybody through, like, eventually I'm going to be cut out of that also.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to make mistakes, but like, I just don't think that we stop dying unless we actually see each other as full human people, and like worthy of like even the worst offenses. Like, even, I think there's part of me that even goes like, in a leftist, socialist, like Marxist, like any of those, some of those I somewhat identify as, but like, whatever my political stances are, like, if I can say even like rich, greedy people are the terrible ones, like, it's still at some level is going like, it's missing the fact that something created, like, there's a system that created rich, evil, greedy people.
Absolutely.
And people are the system, but like, to some degree, the system is actually just like a fully functioning thing on its own, in a lot of ways that like a lot of individual actors don't have a lot of control to stop.
Yeah, and I think that there's a profound dissociation, like, that we are all experiencing on different levels. But I think that, billionaires who are continuing to profit off fossil fuels while we see climate change happening in real time and environmental disasters happening in real time, those people are so profoundly dissociated from reality, from the world, from other human beings. They're very unwell, and like, I definitely hold them to a high degree of responsibility because they have so much power and are literally destroying the planet. I take very strong issue with what they're doing. But I also see that they're very unwell, and this is like a larger, we are all so fucking dissociated.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, right? Is like, I'm like, the mechanisms that make those people separated, that allow them to be so dissociated from all of us, is not all that different to me than what makes me separated from other people around me, And so it's like, I find it far more important to be like, what is it that's causing this level of separation that is actually, I think, making us sick? And even at an economic level, like, there's been a lot of research about how like the larger the economic gap in any individual country, the faster both ends of the spectrum die.
Right.
Like, literally the health of those people is affected at both polarities. And so it's like, what systems actually would cause someone to make people make choices that are against the planet and against people, but like, I'm just a separate, if I can't, like, I guess for me, it's like at an individual level of responsibility, like, I have to just as equally as those people, I think, take responsibility for how I'm cutting people out of my life and dissociating from other people, as I think is important for them to do in order to like stop making shitty choices about fossil fuels, So yeah, to me, it's like an underlying profound level of separation that we have to address, and dissociating from people so easily. I think too, the last thing I'd say is like, to your point, like, I mean, I once posted something like when I reached out to you to have this conversation, I was talking to you about polyamory and monogamy. And in my world, I see those as almost the same thing. I can make the case for them being very similar, or two sides of the same coin, I guess. And at some point I had seen how like queer culture was just like talking about how like if you weren't polyamorous, you weren't enlightened enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so I posted something about it that was like, I'm not critiquing the practice of polyamory or non-monogamy. Mm-hmm. Like, this isn't what this is about. But I am critiquing the fact that like some of us think that we're on a pedestal if we practice certain things rather than others, and trying to articulate that. And I had barely anyone, this is like so fitting for social media, but I had barely anyone who agreed write me in a comment, but a ton of people write me in a direct message to be like,
right,
thank you for fucking saying that. And one person even like reached out to me to be like, I was at this, to your point about like graduate school stuff and class or whatever. Like, she was like, I was at this conference that I think it was some sort of like queer run conference at her university. And it was like a group of younger queers who were like basically saying in this session that if you weren't polyamorous, then you couldn't be queer. And she was like, where have we gone? I'm just so confused. But she was like so grateful for it, you know? And I'm like, yeah, those people who were like, oh my God, thank you for saying this. It's like worth doing it because there are clearly people who need to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you would like to promote?
I just released a couple zines. I just released the follow-up to my zine, Fuck the Police Means We Don't Act Like Cops to Each Other. So basically it's about everything we were just talking about today. Yeah. It's the second, I wasn't really planning on doing a second issue, but I write a lot about these topics. So a lot of the stuff that I was just talking about in this interview is going to be in that zine. I also just released a zine called Fucking Girls. I do put the word fuck in like every single one of my titles for some reason. Thing. Yeah. It's just, I don't know why, but, and that's like a zine that is like, it's like low key, like kind of like X-rated stories about queer sex, but it's also more so about like specifically bisexual anxiety about like dating and fucking women, and then and also like attachment and trauma and like, you know, not wanting to be a creep and not knowing how to express desire and like being used to dating dudes and not knowing like what's going on, and like women like weirdly orbiting each other when they want to date but they don't understand how to make a move. It's about all of that, but then also with like hot sex scenes as well.
Love it.
Yeah. So I just put that out, and both of those you can find on my website, which is clementinemorrigan.com. Yeah, I feel like that's the new stuff. The podcast Fucking Canceled is still ongoing and will continue to be.
Yeah, I really appreciate the gender stuff that you've been talking about in dating too and desire. So I'm excited about that because, yeah, as someone who's attracted to women, it's like, it has definitely been part of my experience also in like organizing in queer culture that it's like, oh, I expressed an attraction about someone in some sort of like excited way. And it was seen as, misogynistic or something. And I was like, right, hold on, wait, I'm so confused. Like, I can't even say that I'm attracted to someone, or like the way that I say it is like really policed.
Which really doesn't help because like a lot of queer women have so much baggage about this stuff already, and just like feeling totally paranoid that like if you do anything, it's going to be like really bad. Instead of, again, just like, how about we learn like communication skills and like learn how to like politely say you're not interested if you're not interested, and like instead of making it like a crime to like express interest, like.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you for doing that work and for all of the work that you do. I know it takes such a toll on you. So I'm so grateful that you continue to speak up and say things that many of us are very profoundly grateful for.
Thanks for having me on here.